I do want to say welcome to you who are watching. My name is Mark Penrith. I'm the pastor at Benoni Baptist Church. And this morning, we continue our rolling conversation with Freedom of Religion South Africa, an advocacy organization which both works to protect and promote your constitutional right to religious freedom in South Africa. And I'm joined by Liesl Pretorius, who's the head of legal at Freedom of Religion. And we're going to be talking about the status of a number of laws and similar developments, some which are before Parliament at the moment, and some which are before government departments that affect religious freedom, including parental rights. And so let's start with the bills, Liesl. What is presently being considered before Parliament? I know that there is a new marriage bill. What's the bill all about? What's good, what's bad, and what is ugly about its status?
Thank you, Mark. Good day, Mark and viewers. Yes, the marriage bill is currently before Parliament. It was introduced in the previous Parliament, and the previous committee that was considering the bill, called the Portfolio Committee on Home Affairs in the National Assembly, they were briefed by the minister. They invited public comments. 4SA was one of the stakeholders who submitted written comments. And then, of course, we had the election, so Parliament dissolved, and now we have a new Parliament. The bill was revived, but it hasn't come up on the committee schedule yet. And Parliament at the moment is also in a constituency period. So what we're just doing is we're watching the committee schedule for when it comes up. I believe that the minister will have to brief the new portfolio committee members because obviously the membership of the committee has changed, and those committee members will have to consider the written submissions that were received, and they'll also need to consider whether they want to open the bill for public submissions, which of course we hope will happen, and we specifically ask for that in our written submissions. So the marriage bill, the good, the bad, and the ugly. From a freedom of religion's perspective, and of course our perspective is faith neutral. So from a general freedom of religion perspective, we believe this is a very good bill. The reason for the bill is to address the fragmented marriage law system in South Africa. We have the Marriage Act, we have the Civil Union Act, and we have the Customary Marriages Act. So we have three different pieces of legislation. And what the government wanted to do, based on the white paper that they developed subsequent to extensive public consultation, is to take everything and put it into one bill that caters for everyone equally and fairly. A positive features about this new bill is that it recognized certain religious marriages that weren't previously recognized, subject to certain minimum basic requirements that protects the parties and that make common sense. For example, is their consent and things like that. And it also protects the religious freedom right of religious marriage officers, which of course is a big concern. You don't want any pastor or rabbi or imam or any religious marriage officer connected to a religious institution being forced to solemnize a marriage that goes against their religious beliefs or the religious beliefs of the organization that they belong. And what is interesting, Mark, is that when this bill, the last version of the bill, before the Department of Home Affairs, before it went to Parliament, did not have that express protection in. And we currently have that express protection in our Marriage Act. And we contended for that and say, don't just say that it's implied, it has to be there explicitly, so that we know that that protection is still there. And it was included. It is in the current version of the bill. So that's very positive. There's one concern that we have with the bill, and that concerns your ex officio marriage officers. So these are people employed by the Department of Home Affairs, marriage magistrates, for example, as well. And they can be forced to solemnize any marriage, irrespective of whether it accords with their conscience. And obviously, we live in a constitutional democracy, so the state has to deliver services equally to all people. So we said a practical solution would be to separate when it comes to ex officio marriage officers, the solemnization aspect, which is very religious or has a religious nature to it, from the administrative registering aspect, because then it becomes like registering a birth or a marriage, a birth or a death. Yes. So then there shouldn't be a religious issue if there's no religious ceremony or component involved. So that will protect conscientious rights. And something that this new marriage bill does is it opens up the categories of people who can become marriage officers, so that each group, whether religious or cultural or secular or otherwise, can have their own designated marriage officers, so that everybody has somebody who is willing and able to conduct their marriages.
Liesl, I can remember following this bill with interest last year, and I think at the beginning of this year, we at least spoke about it. I'm going to continue to keep my eye on this. As a pastor, obviously, marriage is really of great interest to the church, and so I was very encouraged by the way that the bill went, and look forward to hearing as it continues to progress. But let's move on to the spy bill. The spy bill. Now I remember massive public outcry on the spy bill last year, and then again just before the elections, there was a lot of conversation about it. Where are we sitting in terms of it? And should the religious community be concerned about it?
Yes, Mark, quite rightly, there was a lot of outcry and controversy about this spy bill. So the formal name is the General Intelligence Laws Amendment Bill. It has been passed by Parliament. It was passed on the 16th of May. So now it awaits presidential signature. And the last time I checked, it hasn't been signed by the president yet. The good news is that the most serious and all the significant religious freedom concerns of this bill has been addressed. And if anybody wonders what those concerns were, so in the original version, what basically would have happened is that it would have given the state security agencies, in other words, spies, the power to subject religious leaders and organizations to mandatory security vetting in order to grant security competence certificates. And on the basis of this, apparently that this can decide whether your religious organization can continue to operate or not. So that is incredible overreach. And I mean, we understand if you're a person who works with critical infrastructure or actual confidential state information, or you access national key points, that you should be security vetted. But
Yeah.
religious organizations across the board, no, that opens the door wide to abuse. So luckily there was a public outcry and there was a lot of public participation. We ran a campaign, and this really is a testimony to the power of public participation. The members who sat on this special ad hoc committee that considered this bill, they did incredible good work. Like I said, basically all the religious freedom concerns have been addressed. So we're very happy with the final version of the bill. So I think the religious community can breathe a huge sigh of relief.
Liesl, you guys do fantastic work as Freedom of Religion South Africa. Even before we get to the end of the interview, let me just say thank you so much and strength to you. So far, 2 bills in, and it's fairly good news on both of them. Let's get to one that, again, was incredibly controversial, but has now gone from being a bill to being an act, and that's the Hate Speech Act. Where are we as far as that concerned? Is it now a crime to use hate speech, and what is hate speech according to the Act?
Yes, so I think this one is perhaps not so good news. So the hate speech bill was signed into law on the 6th of May. So we have the Hate Speech Act. It's not yet operable. So just because this act becomes a law doesn't make it operable immediately. This one, its operability is standing over until there's a proclamation in the government gazette. And last time I checked, there hasn't been one yet. So this one is a concern. Statutory hate speech is now a crime, but the act cannot be enforced until it is operable. And the reason why this bill, or act rather, we have to remember it's a hate speech act now. The reason why it is so controversial is because its definition of hate speech is very wide, much wider than the Constitution, and even wider than the Equality Act, which has a civil definition of hate speech. And one would think, logically speaking, that criminal hate speech is reserved for more serious offences or more serious instances. But because this bill has a wider definition, on the face of it, it might be easier to be found guilty of a criminal hate speech offense than a civil hate speech offense. So it's basically when somebody communicates an expression has a wide meaning. It can be words, it can be gestures and images, even an expression that promotes that is harmful, incites harm, and promotes or advocates hatred against specifically identified groups of persons. So you have the definition of harm. That's a key definition, but it's very wide. The definition of harm includes emotional harm, psychological harm, physical harm. but also social harm and economic harm. So those are very wide concepts. And social harm is defined as anything that undermines the social cohesion of the people of South Africa. That's very wide for a criminal law. So that's concerning.
Yes.
And then hatred for this bill is not defined. And with criminal laws, you want terms to be defined, because when terms are uncertain, they're open to subjective interpretation, arbitrary application. It means the law is not applied equally to all. And then this bill has an extended list of grounds on the basis of which hate speech can be committed. The Constitution only has 4. If you take the Kwalani judgment, it's 5. The Equality Act has 9 grounds, 9 or so grounds. This bill, it's wider in some, and it has novel grounds, for example, gender identity and controversial and contested ideas like that. So we are concerned, how will this play out in practice? Can this bill be weaponized against people of faith who speak not from a place of hatred, but they're just communicating respectfully their sincerely held beliefs without undermining someone else's human dignity and equality? So these are important questions. And then the bill has some religious exemption clauses, but they're worded so circularly that they're actually self-defeating. So this is a very worrying bill, Mark. So what are we doing at the moment? We are considering options. One option is seeing whether there can be an amendment to this act, an amendment bill. Obviously, litigation is also an option to consider, but this definitely is something to watch, because it's a grave concern for freedom of expression in general, but freedom of religious expression.
I mean, Liesl, help me and the viewers out. What ends up happening in a case like this? We wait until somebody has been charged under the Act, and then that charge gets brought to the courts, and then we test the Act's, I don't know, kind of like structure, its internal robustness in the actual court, or does somebody have to be brought to court, be found guilty, and then the Act needs to be brought to the Constitutional Court to find out if it is actually constitutional, or if it goes beyond the Constitution? Is that kind of the process in layman's terms? How will this work out?
There are various ways. The one way is for example, for an amendment bill to be introduced, but there needs to be political will for an amendment bill. Then it doesn't have to go to the court, because then the Act and its operability can kind of stand over until the amendment bill goes through and is passed, and then you have an Act that's more constitutionally sound. The other, you can, before the Act is operable, to bring a case to court to test the constitutionality of the definition of hate speech, because that's where you will focus. And you'll also probably look at the procedural aspects, because there were so many thousands and thousands of submissions that were concerned about this bill. And Parliament needs to apply its mind. Yes, public participation is not a referendum, but there were calls even from the South African Human Rights Commission that the definition for hatred should be introduced, and it wasn't done. So there are questions about, did the majority of the MPs apply their minds? Yes. There were certainly some MPs on the committee who were applying their minds, but they might not have been the majority. And in the end, the majority votes the bill through.
Yes.
So that's one way. The other way that you mentioned, where somebody is charged and then the case becomes a constitutional issue, because you can always then join that case as an amicus, and it becomes a constitutional test case. That will only happen once the bill is operable, because you cannot charge somebody unless the bill is operable. But you can, before the bill is operable, bring an in-principle case to test the constitutionality on substantive and procedural grounds. So it's basically one of those 3 options.
And also, I just remember from experience where we've had to test bills against the Constitution, it is sometimes an incredibly slow process. It's very careful, very thorough, and involves a lot of advocates.
It is. And what's concerning about that process, it's a long process, because you typically start in the High Court, and you go to the Supreme Court of Appeal, and then you go to the Constitutional Court. You can apply for direct access to the Constitutional Court, but they can refuse that access. And it's a very costly exercise. It's a very costly exercise, and you don't want to. You would rather want a bill to have been passed that is more constitutionally sound.
Liesl, can we lastly just very briefly touch on parental rights? We've been talking about the comprehensively sexual education. No, not comprehensive sexual education, but comprehensive sexuality education. We've been talking about that for the last couple of months with Michael. But maybe you can just give us an idea of where things are right now. What do parents actually need to know?
Yes, I think the reason why we keep coming back to comprehensive sexuality education, or CSE for short, is that a lot of parents still don't know their rights or might not be aware of this, because the department continues to push CSE, and and sometimes an impression can be created through what is done, not perhaps on purpose, but what is done can create an impression that CSE is compulsory, and it definitely is not. There is a sex ed component to the LO subject, but schools, teachers have a choice in what learning materials they can use to teach that component. The minister, the previous minister of basic education, confirmed this in Parliament. So that's a done deal. You can choose what materials you want to use, and then there are values-based alternative materials. And you can just also use the materials that schools have been using before CSE is introduced, because it complies with the outcomes of the CAPS curriculum. So that's the important thing. So as a parent, you need to be aware what materials are being used. You need to be involved in your children's schooling and their lives. As a teacher, you can obviously also raise this with the school and say, I don't believe that this materials accords with our school community or some of the parents, and they need to be made aware of it. So if there are parents who are happy with it, okay, fine. But if there are parents who are not happy with it, can they opt out their children? Can we consider alternative materials? And that's also why the school governing body is so important. They can decide, no, we want to use this alternative program, for example, the alternative program that more accords with the values of the particular school community. So I think that's very important. Another issue around parental rights is this early childhood education toolkit, for example. And it kind of links to the same, I think, trend of what is happening in the basic education sector. So with that, what this toolkit does, the early childhood education toolkit, it basically introduces transgender ideology into pre-primary and primary schools and ECD centers. And what's concerning about that is, firstly, that parents weren't consulted in the development or rollout of it. I think many parents are completely unaware of this toolkit.
Yes.
And the way that it presents only one view. It presents a view where gender exists on a spectrum and sex exists on a spectrum, versus in South Africa, there are other views. If you're a Christian, a traditional Christian, you will have a different view than that. If you're a traditional Muslim, you will have a different view than that. And we live in a constitutional democracy, and we understand we have a diversity of people. But the important thing is that parents need to be consulted. The white paper on education and training of 1995, which is a very important policy document within the Department of Basic Education, says unequivocally that parents have the inalienable right to determine or to choose the kind of education that is best for their children, particularly in the early years of schooling. This is an early childhood education toolkit. And the basis of that education includes the cultural and religious basis. So that's in that choice. And if you present a worldview, a specific worldview, a specific ideological view on sex and gender, that's not value neutral. It's not ideologically neutral. Yes. And it's presented in such a way that other worldviews that constitutionally are equally protected and relevant are excluded or marginalized. That is not okay, because schools need to be ideologically neutral.
Yes.
Ideological neutrality in the public school context doesn't mean there's no place for religion, or we should be a religion-free zones. It only means that all the religions present in that school community need to be treated even-handedly, and one single one cannot be promoted above the others and the others excluded. That's basically what it means, because we have a public school systems, or schools belong to the community. So that's concerning, Mark. We have met twice with the department. We are seeking to meet with the minister just to set forward concerns, because the concern is not to, we don't want anybody excluded or marginalized or bullied or discriminated against, but we want parental rights protected. Parents need to have an opportunity to be consulted, and so that this toolkit actually reflects the diversity that is of South African families. At the moment, it does not reflect the diversity, and in that way that we don't believe it's constitutional. But we endeavor to continue with that and to see whether we can get a meeting, because our goal is to present constructive solutions that will ensure that all views are protected and that persons of faith, parents of faith, that their right to raise their own children according to their own religious beliefs and moral values are not undermined.
Liesl, you guys do incredibly important work, and you do a lot of work. I do want to just take a moment to point viewers to where they can find out more about the work of 4SA and even support 4SA. They can go to your website, that's www.4sa, that's forsa.org.za, and there you can find a newsletter sign up, you can find mechanisms for donating, you can find a number of articles that have been written on each of the topics that we've spoken about today. You can also find information on YouTube. You guys have a number of videos on YouTube and on other social medias, Facebook in particular. You guys post to there from time to time. I'd encourage listeners to go to any of those places to find out more about the good work that Freedom of Religion South Africa is doing. Liesl, as always, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate interviewing you guys. I always learn a lot out of it and take away a lot to think about. So thank you so much for your efforts.
Thank you, Mark. It's only a privilege and honor to do this work.